Okay, so we now go on to study one of the greatest applications of game theory, which lies in the area of auction design. Now, auctions are everywhere around us, both in online and offline worlds. So, one of the most famous online companies, which goes by the name of eBay, was primarily concerned and is still primarily concerned with auctioning of different items. So, there's also a very funny anecdote about this company, which was, by the way, started by a computer programmer. So one of the first items that this company was selling was actually broken printers, right? So it was not that printers where they were selling and it turned out to be defective, but they had listed it as broken printers, right? And then kind of like once the item was made for sale, the person who had put it for sale was very surprised to kind of like find that actually there was somebody who was willing to pay a large amount of money, right? And in fact, then this programmer actually contacted this person saying that, okay, are you aware that this printer is broken? You are still willing to pay such a substantial amount of money. And then the person says that, yes, I am interested in collecting broken down printers, right? So that tells us that, there is often kind of like markets for things that you may not even realize when you are kind of like putting it out for auctions, right? Okay, but eBay then goes on to sell, of course, not just exotic items, but also very kind of like regular items, right? So one question from eBay's perspective is that, how do you design based on the good that you are selling? What are the proper auction rules to follow in order to perhaps maximize revenue, right? So that might be one question. Another example coming from online world is Google's auction designing problem, right? So if you have noticed, Google kind of like makes a substantial amount of money from selling advertisement slots. And the way in which it allocates advertisement slots to different items or companies is by actually auctioning off those spots, right? So then the question is like, what are the auction designing rules that Google should follow in order to kind of determine which company or item should get what slot, right? And pay what price. So that would be one question. Another example, this time from an offline world that you might be familiar with, is this IPL auctions, right? So every few years, you have this phenomena where a set of players are available kind of for allocation to different teams, and then different teams have to devise different strategies and think about which are the players for which they want to kind of bid what amount of money, right? So typically, each of the teams are given a certain amount of budget, and out of the budget, they have to decide what players to kind of spend that budget on. And typically, this auction happens sequentially in the sense that you have got one player which comes out, then the teams have to decide whether to bid for that player or not, and then decide according to what players they have got and the strategy they have, how do you kind of like decide what to bid, right? So very interesting problem, right? You also have auctions in various government arenas, right? So whenever the government is thinking of kind of like a service, public service that has to be provided, they may often go in for auctions, right? So auctioning of, for example, airport construction project or a highway construction project, these are very common. Auctioning of spectrum spaces, right? So you might have heard of this 2G, 3G, 4G auctions. These are also there. Auctions are also there whenever we are thinking of how share prices are determined, liquidity is determined in the market, and so on, right? So clearly, auctions are everywhere in the world, and so it's important to study those things. However, there's another reason why economists and game theorists have spent a lot of time trying to kind of analyze various kinds of auctions. And the reason is this is probably one of the simplest forms of buyer-seller interaction, right? So economists are often concerned about thinking about how do trading arrangements happen and what are the issues that come up. So auctions are basically an example of one of the simpler forms of trading arrangements that come up, right? So the idea is by studying such a simpler version of buying, selling auction, buyer seller interaction, you can learn about more complicated form of economic interactions as well, right? So we are going to start off in this lecture by considering the simplest possible auction case, which is the case of a seller auctioning off one item to a set of buyers, right? Notice that this is a bit different from the IPL problem, for example, because you've got a set of players that have to be allocated among different teams, right? Here, in contrast, we are looking at just the case of one seller auctioning one item to a set of buyers, okay? In more complex situations, you might have multiple goods being sold, which will be the case when you have got Google trying to auction off different advertisement slots or kind of like the auction of different players to different teams. You might have goods being sold over time. So again, this is what happens in the IPL case. So these are all very interesting real world features. But for now, we are going to be looking at a simpler case where you have got auction of only one item to a set of players at only one point in time. Okay, so this is the setup that we are going to start out by thinking. So we need to put in a bit structure before we start analyzing this thing. So the underlying assumption that we are going to make when thinking about how to model auctions is that we are going to assume that each bidder, so who are the bidders? These are the buyers, right? Each bidder has an intrinsic value for the item being auctioned. Okay. So what that means is that each of the bidders is willing to purchase the item for a price up to this value, but not at any other higher price, right? And we are going to call this intrinsic value as the bidder's true value for the item. Okay, so this is a piece of notation that you have to be familiar with. Okay, so what are the different types of auctions? And you might have seen, by the way, some of them in the movies as well, right? So the one that is most commonly seen in different movies and TV shows where you have got basically an auctioneer kind of like saying, this is the price, how many of you are willing to bid at this price or higher price? Then somebody names a price, right? And then the auctioneer again asks, okay, is somebody willing to match this price and bid higher, right? So this is an example where you have got an ascending bid auction, right? Why? Because the bids basically keep on ascending, right? And this is also known as English auctions. So here the seller gradually raises the price and bidders are going to drop out until only one bidder remains. And then that bidder wins the object at that final price, right? So this is what English auctions are. Another type of auctions, which is the opposite of this ascending bid auction, is called descending bid auction, right? So here what happens is that the seller or the auctioneer gradually lowers the price from some high initial value till the point where a bidder actually accepts the price and then pays that current price, right? So these are also known as Dutch auctions. And in fact, these auctions actually became famous for their use in the Dutch flower market, right? So Netherlands or Holland is actually one of the most prominent places for acting as an intermediary for trade in flower. And you can actually search this on YouTube as well. You would have like scenes where in a place you have got flowers from different parts of the world coming in. And then you have got a clock which will kind of like, start from a high price and keep lowering the price till somebody says that, okay, I'm willing to buy at that price. And that is the price at which the good is going to be sold off. So these are descending bid auctions. You can also have something called first price sealed bid auction. So here, the word sealed bid means that buyers are going to kind of write simultaneously sealed bids to the sellers, right? So basically under, say, a piece of paper or an envelope or contract, they're going to write down whatever they are going to bid for the item. And this is not information that is available to all the other players, right? So in contrast to this ascending bid where everybody can see, what is the final bid at that time and then kind of like decide what to buy. So in the sealed bid auctions, you cannot see what others have bid, right? And once all the bids have come in, then basically the auctioneer is going to say what is the highest possible bid and is going to allocate that item to the person who has bid the highest. And then that person has to pay whatever that person has bid, right? So this is the first price sealed bid auction. You can have another type of auction, which is known as the second price sealed bid auction. So just as first price sealed bid auction, here two people write down their valuation for the good or their amount of money that they are willing to pay for the good on the in the sealed envelope. And by the way, this need not be actual valuation, right? We'll come to this distinction where the person may actually be willing to pay an amount different from their actual valuation, right? So we'll come to this question whether the bidder has the incentive to write down the actual bid, but they will write down some amount. Now, then the seller or the auctioneer is going to collect all these bids, and then they're going to open the bids and then see which is the highest bid for the item, right? So the item will be then given to the highest person who had submitted the highest possible bid. But here is the twist. The person does not have to pay what she has written down, but she has to pay what the second highest person had written, right? So we'll soon see that this auction has some very interesting properties, even though it may seem a bit weird. So this auction also is named Vickrey auctions after the famous economist Vickrey, who had won a Nobel Prize due to his work in similar areas, right? So these are some things that we will study. Okay, so before we get into more details, let's just focus on the role of information in thinking about auctions, right? So in contrast to what we are going to discuss, let's take a very stylized example to see what happens if you have auctions with known values, right? What do we mean by known values? This means that everybody knows how much everybody else values the object for, right? So this information is known. So let's consider a simple case. So you have got one seller and you have got different buyers, and the seller and the buyers both know each other's values for the item, right? So that means that the seller knows how much does each of the buyers value the item for. And the buyer also knows, how much the seller cares about the item or values the item, right? So suppose that the seller values the item at X and is trying to sell an item, right? And the maximum value held by a potential buyer among these different buyers, the maximum willingness to pay for this item is by some buyer whose willingness to pay for this item is given by Y, which is larger than X, right? Now, in this case, if a trade happens in the sense that the seller actually kind of like gives the item to the person with the highest bid, then there is actually a surplus of Y minus X that can be generated by the sale of this item, right? Why is this surplus being generated? Because the item is actually going from someone who values it at X, and it's going to someone who values it more at Y, right? And the amount by which this person values it more compared to the seller is this gap Y minus X, right? So that's the surplus. Now, suppose initially this condition is true that the seller knows the different values of the buyers, right? And so what can the seller do? Then the seller can simply go ahead and announce that this item is available for a sale at a fixed price just below Y. Remember, Y is the highest valuation that any of these buyers have for the product, right? The person who has the highest valuation for this product has a valuation of Y, right? And the seller announces that he's going to make the product available at a price slightly below Y, and he's not going to be accepting any lower price. So what will happen in this case? So in this case, the person who had a valuation of Y for the item will buy the item. Why? Because then the person is still has a higher value compared to the price that this person is asked to pay. And basically, this full value of the surplus is going to end up going to the seller, right? So seller will basically get a surplus of Y minus X. Okay. Now, one important thing in this example is that the seller has to have the ability to commit to this mechanism that the seller has used for selling the object, right? So what do we mean by the mechanism? This thing that we just discussed here, right? The rule that the seller had formulated. Now, why is this commitment important? Because suppose that the seller could not commit, right? What could have happened is that the buyer could have said that, okay, I don't believe that when you say that, you are not going to accept any price just below Y, I'll pay you just a price below Y, but above X, right? So just above X. Now, in case the seller did not stick to his commitment to actually pay what he had announced, and then accepts this, then this whole mechanism does not work, right? Then actually the price is not going to be this price just below Y, and the seller will not be able to actually take all of the surplus that is being generated, right? So when the seller says that, I'm going to accept only a price slightly below Y and nothing else, then the seller actually has to stick to this commitment, right? So this is the implicit assumption here, right? You could have also framed the story in the opposite way, where instead of the seller going to the buyer and saying, why don't you accept it for just a price below Y? Suppose the buyer had the right to make offers to the seller, then the seller could have, for example, the buyer could have said, I am not going to buy it unless you kind of like give it a price just above X, right? So that could have also been the story, in which case the buyer would have got all the surplus, right? So, but these are the extreme cases that you get whenever you have got auctions with known values. So in contrast, our focus is going to be where you have got auctions with unknown values, right? So what are the type of scenarios that can come up here? So one scenario is that buyers have independent valuation for the good, right? And this valuation for the good is just known to the buyers, right? To themselves, but not to each of the different buyers, right? So for example, if suppose you have got 4 buyers, so buyer 1 knows exactly what is buyer 1's value for the good, but buyer 2, 3, and 4 does not know what is buyer 1's value of the good, right? And how these valuations are independently generated, right? So this is one case which we'll be discussing. This often goes by the name IPV, where I stands for independent, P stands for private, and V stands for values, right? Okay. So each buyer knows how much she values the item. She does not know how much others value it, and her value for the item does not depend on the others' values, right? So this is the type of scenario that happens when the buyers are interested in just consuming the item, right? With their values reflecting how much they would enjoy it. So imagine that there is some particular one-off type of bakery item that has come available in the market, and then I kind of like think of auctioning it off among some people I know. So each of them may have different preferences for actually consuming this bakery item, and so they may be willing to pay different items. So in this case, an independent private valuation model will be more appropriate. Another scenario that we'll often study is what is known as a common value scenario, right? So here, imagine that basically an item is being auctioned, and instead of consuming it, each of the buyers are basically just interested in reselling the item if they manage to get hold of the item, right? So you can think of this as an example where they are trying to bid for art item with the intention that all of them would later on go and like sell it in another market, right? So there now you have got a common value in the sense that we don't know actually what is going to be the value for which they'll be able to later sell it, right? But this is some unknown item, but this is some actual item that the common value is there, right? It's just that we don't know it, right? What is the common value in this example? So this is basically the value is going to be the equal to how much revenue this future reselling of this item is going to generate, right? So we'll see that based on these different assumptions that you might have, common values or independent private values, there'll be kind of like different insights that will come in terms of how to think about designing the auction, for example, to maximize